Hi, guys, and welcome to another episode of Finance for Founders. Finance for Founders. This is the second time I've actually muffled on saying that. This podcast delves into the journey of visionary entrepreneurs shaping their industry. And today we have the honor of hosting Sharon Gillenwater, a trailblazer in the tech startup world. As the co-founder and former CEO of Boardroom Insiders, Sharon built and scaled a company to a successful exit of $25 million exit in 2022. In her memoirs, Scaling with Soul, How I Built and Sold a $25 million tech company without being an a-hole. She shares her experience and insights on building a tech company with integrity. Join us as we explore Sharon's path to entrepreneurship, the challenges she faced, and the lessons she learned along the way. Sharon, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So, Sharon, I'm going to ask a few quick fire questions. You have approximately 10 seconds to answer each question. And we ask you these questions so that our audience get to know a little bit more about you. Are you ready?
Yeah, sorry, I'm coughing over here.
Fantastic. Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
Early bird or night owl?
Early bird.
Favorite book?
East of Eden by John Steinbeck.
One word to describe yourself.
Determined.
I love that. Favorite hobby?
Playing competitive mahjong.
Mahjong, what's that?
Mahjong, it's a Chinese tile game. However, I play American style mahjong.
I want to research that afterwards. Mountains or beaches?
Mountains.
Considering where you're from?
Yeah.
Excellent. Favorite tech gadget?
The Eufy robot vacuum. Not sexy, but I love it. I have 2 pets.
What pets do you have?
I have a dog and a cat, and they both shed horribly. So the robot vacuum is amazing, and this brand is much better than the Roomba and cheaper too.
Fantastic. I've got one. My wife absolutely loves it. I can't quite get my head around it. Last movie you watched?
The Substance. Look it up before you go because it's really something. It may not be your cup of tea.
Fantastic. Your favorite movie?
Oh, favorite movie. Probably I love slapstick, so I love What's Up, Doc, which also takes place in San Francisco, which is my favorite city in the world.
Okay. Favorite cuisine?
Would have to be Mexican food. That's true to where I'm from.
And one thing you can't live without?
One thing I can't live without. I forgot what I said here. I had an answer. Oh, washcloths. I take them when I travel. I take them when I travel in case the place I'm staying doesn't have any.
Fantastic. And I'll add this additional question. What was your first job?
I scooped ice cream at Baskin-Robbins when I was 15 and a half. I got a job the day that I turned 15 and a half, which was the limit. And that was the only job I could find.
Fantastic. Sharon, once more, want to thank you for taking part in those quick fire questions. Now, we're going to just ask a few questions. Some of the questions are a little bit about your background, your upbringing, how your upbringing has influenced your business. And one of the things I want to ask you as well is growing up in Ocean Beach, California, during the 1970s, how did your upbringing shape your aspirations and approach to entrepreneurship?
Well, I was an only child, so I was used to spending a lot of time by myself, thinking and reading. And as we know, entrepreneurship, especially in the early stages, can be a lonely endeavor, and that doesn't bother me at all. So it was a good match for how I grew up. But, later in my upbringing, when I became a teenager, I ended up at a very fancy private school, even though my parents could not afford it. That's kind of a longer story, but it exposed me to, you know, education, wealth, tremendous wealth, people very different from the family that I grew up in, and it turned me into a bit of a striver. I wanted that kind of a life for myself. So I think it did have a big impact. It also, my parents didn't go to college, so it exposed me to a group of people where the assumption was that everyone is going to college and everyone is going to have some kind of profession. And so that had an impact also.
That's amazing. So your time in college, was it obvious that maybe you were not as affluent as others? I discovered that when I speak to a few people, during their childhood, they weren't aware, but only until when they grew up, they became adults, they realized actually, we weren't actually able to afford that, or we were quite different from the rest. So was it something that was quite obvious to you? And so as a result, you gained some kind of inferiority complex, and so you had to do things to kind of overcome that?
Yeah, it was obvious when friends would come over to our house as opposed to going to their own house. And when I started dating and I would get picked up, and I lived quite far from the school. I lived about a half an hour drive away, and some of those folks had never even been to my area of the city and would be like, wow, you know, very, very different from most of the other people at the school. So I don't think it gave me an inferiority complex, but it did give me a desire to make what I have as good as possible, So I tend to want everything very neat and tidy and clean, and make everything look as good as it can be. Make
Yeah,
the most of what you have, in other words.
absolutely. And what I was going to say now, for our audience that are not aware of you, do you want to give them a little bit more about Boardroom Insiders, what it was exactly, and how you managed to scale it?
Yeah. Well, Boardroom Insiders was my third startup. I had started a couple of other ventures before that, one for which I raised venture capital, and that failed in spectacular fashion. A second, which was just a small kind of consultancy that I was running. And Boardroom Insiders grew out of the consulting practice. I was doing consulting for big tech marketers, and big tech like Cisco and Oracle and Google and HP, those types of companies. And I started to see a pattern and emerge, which was they were struggling to sell higher in their customer organizations because tech deals were getting bigger and more consequential for their customers. When you're deploying technology across an enterprise and it touches every aspect of the business, C-level players like the CFOs or the chief information officers, or sometimes even the CEOs, want to understand what they're buying and why, and what the business impact is going to be. And so big tech salespeople and marketers were having to have conversations in the C-suite of their customers, and they were not comfortable with that. They did not know how to have those conversations. And they realized that the conversation was not talking about their products and services. It was more talking about the business impact that the customer could expect to see from deploying their products and services. And in order to have those conversations, you need to know who you're talking to, what they care about, what their business initiatives are, what their challenges are, and that requires a lot of information. And so I started producing these dossiers on C-level executives for the benefit of sales call prep for my clients. And I realized that every tech company in the Valley was chasing the same 2,500 or so executives. And so I put all of those dossiers in a database and started to keep them updated, and launched a subscription database service. And then a few years after that, I launched a SaaS product that kind of pulled from the database and offered insight into aggregates of people. So it's like a persona, except the people are real people that you're basing it on. So, if you have 50 CIOs you care about in the world, you could create a group of those 50 and track what they're all talking about and what they have in common and how they're connected to your own executives. So that was Boardroom Insiders. And it took about 14 years to build all of that and scale it up to 5 million in annual recurring revenue, at which time we sold it for 25 million in cash.
That is absolutely amazing. What was your background before starting? How did you get an interest? Now, I know you initially started a business, which your sister, I believe, helped you fund. Is it Fidget or something like that? Then you
Yeah,
started the
my sister-in-law.
consultancy.
Yeah.
You started the consultancy and then the SaaS space business. I want to kind of see the journey from where you were. I think you were in marketing as well beforehand, before you now began to go into entrepreneur. So if you could just talk us through that journey and how you found yourself at Boardroom Insider. I find it very, very intriguing. And another question which I want to ask now, when I looked at the dates of when you started it right in the middle of a recession, 2008. And so at some point, I want to ask you, what were the challenges that you may have experienced? I've said a lot there. So let's just start from your job, starting your first business, and then get into Boardroom Insiders.
Well, the common thread, my background is all over the place. I've worked at magazines. I've worked as a freelance writer for newspapers. I worked in sales and marketing at startups. But the common thread, I think, through my entire career is I'm a content person. I value content and good writing and well-crafted content and well-researched content. And I learned early on to really make everything you do defensible. So when you write something or do a report, you have to be prepared to defend everything you've put in that report and where you got it. And so that's really the foundation of everything that I've done. And, I started my career out of college at a city magazine. Most cities back in the 90s had, city magazine. San Diego Magazine was the name of it. And it covered, events and restaurants and news about the city. And so I started there after doing an internship as a junior editor and loved my time there, but it didn't pay very well. And I saw that I was not going to make a great living as a writer. And so I went to grad school and got more exposure to business and economics and strategy. But the real pivot point, I think, came when I moved to San Francisco and I got a job at a startup, because in the late 90s in San Francisco, it was just booming with startups. And it was the first wave of the internet. And all the startups were using digital technology and the internet to create completely new business models. So it was a very exciting time in San Francisco. And I joined this startup and I was doing sales, which was a new thing for me. But the CEO said, I think you should join us and be a salesperson. I know you can do it. And so she was an excellent mentor and I did succeed in sales, but it was a real struggle. But the thing that I loved was how you can have such an impact as a startup almost immediately. If you work hard and you're smart, you become an indispensable member of the team within mere months. And, there's no place to hide. So everything you achieve is celebrated and appreciated, but you better achieve something or you're going to be out, because there's literally no place to kind of hang out and pretend you're doing work like there is in a bigger corporate environment.
Fantastic. Excellent. And so from the startup, you now pivoted to starting your first startup. So you're working within startups. What did you see in those startups that gave you the desire to want to start a business? There is something that you've mentioned at the beginning. Some people talk about when you have a startup, you should find your passion, you should have a vision, so on and so forth. But you mentioned that when you were went to your private school, it gave you something that inspired you, different lifestyle, and kind of exposed you to kind of the lifestyle you wanted to get when you're older. How much of that, or what was the percentage that contributed to having a lifestyle, being rich, earning money, and having a passion for the things that you're doing?
Well, it's all important. I never thought that I could achieve what I have achieved. Even when I started Boardroom Insiders, I did things the way that I set up the business that made it clear to me in retrospect that I thought, oh, this is probably not going to go anywhere. It might be a nice little consulting tool, a tool for my consulting business, but I don't think I'm going to succeed at building a product or a company that I could sell for millions. I mean, I wanted to do that, but I didn't believe that I could. Otherwise, I would have done some things differently in the beginning. I would have set the company up in a way that would be appropriate for selling it in later years, right? So that was one thing, but I think I might have lost the thread of your question a little bit. But yeah, it didn't, there's not one point that was the origin of what I decided I wanted. It was things happening along the way. So one thing that happened when I was working at the startup in San Francisco is a few years in, I had a baby. And suddenly the excitement of taking the train downtown every day to work in an office was not as appealing. I wanted to be at home and I didn't want to spend so much time commuting. And at the same time, our company had merged with another company. And with a merger, sometimes comes a lot of BS, frankly. There's a lot of change and you may not like all the change and things get more, suddenly the company was more than double the size that it was when I joined it. And it became a lot more bureaucratic and it was harder to get things done. And I like to get things done quickly and I like to move fast. And I didn't enjoy that. So while I was feeling that way after my first son was born, that's when my sister-in-law said, she said, I bought all these domain names and I have an idea for one of them. But she was an executive at Sony at the time and she didn't have time to do that. And so she said, why don't you go and do it? And she said, I have the domain name Fidget and I have 45,000 from the sale of another domain name. And that could be your startup capital. And, I'll advise you and run with it. And so that's how Fidget came about.
That's amazing. For somebody to bring to your domain name 1.5K, it suggests to me people within your family already knew your potential. It suggests to me that people knew you're a hard worker. It suggests to me that people have seen you produce results one way or the other. What was it that drew your in-laws' attention to you and specifically and pointed out this opportunity to you?
Well, it's a very entrepreneurial family that I married into, and that was definitely an asset for me because I didn't know anything about entrepreneurship. For example, at my grad school, there was a whole entrepreneurship club. Did I join it? No, because I thought, I don't know anything about that. So it was only after, I think at the time I'd only been married maybe 3 years, but I took a job at a startup that was not that impressive on the surface to my in-laws, I believe. No one ever totally said that, but, they were all corporate people. They worked at, Silicon Graphics and Sony and HBO and all these things. So the fact that I took a job at an unknown startup that did localization services, that was not that impressive. But what happened was I became very successful there. It took me a while. It took me about 9 months before I started really selling anything, which it's amazing I wasn't fired. But my boss believed in me. She knew I could do it, and she mentored me. And she also, by the way, was one of these people who had a vision, and she sold me into the company based on her vision. But when I got in, I realized her vision was more of a vision than reality. For example, she would say, "Oh, we do we translate all of Patagonia and Gap's materials into 15 languages. We translate United Airlines frequent flyer newsletters into all these languages." Well, I got in there and I realized all they were translating for Gap and Patagonia were hang tags. they, they they weren't. The company wasn't really doing what she was describing to the extent that she was describing it. But I bought into that vision, and I thought that was amazing and fantastic and exciting. And guess what? Within a year, we were doing everything she said and more.
Wow.
She said, we translate consumer catalogs into all these languages. Well, they really only had one, but within a year and a half of me joining and me focusing on that, we had Williams Sonoma. We had Victoria's Secret we were translating into multiple language. We had just all of these major consumer catalogs, and it's because she created a vision for me that I could understand, and then she just set me loose to make it happen. And so I think my in-laws were probably surprised that I succeeded to the degree that I did at this little company that didn't seem like much. And I started making a lot of money and traveling all over the place to see clients, going to visit LL Bean in Maine and Victoria's Secret in New York City. And I created something out of almost nothing under the mentorship of my boss there. So that's probably what they saw. It's very different being a corporate person versus being a startup person. And I was obviously thriving in that startup environment.
That's fantastic. And so this startup company eventually get merged with another company. Things began to slow down, meaning that there was a lot more policies in place and politics and procedures that meant that you were not able to be as fast as you would in a startup. And so now we'll fast forward from this startup into starting Frigid. Clearly as well, your in-laws have seen that you've had an impact. By the way, can I ask, did you have, being that as a startup, one of the things that I see with early startups is that a lot of people have equity in the business, especially if they are high performing and the business is doing well. Is that something that you did?
Yeah, I had equity in the business. I mean, when we started it, we didn't really define what that was. It was my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law, my husband, and me in the beginning. And we didn't sit there and hammer out some kind of contract or legal document. There's a lot of trust there. And we just thought, well, let's see what happens. Why do a bunch of paperwork when we don't even know what this is going to be? But we ended up raising $3 million in venture capital. And in preparation for doing that, that's when we put all of the documentation together. And frankly, I don't even remember what my personal percentage was, but all four of us, kind of the founding team, even though some of them were not actually working much in the business, we all had equity. But when we raised the venture capital, we went with an incubator, which is a different thing now than it was then. Back then, what most incubators did was they took a majority stake in your company and they took over key functions like HR, finance, accounting. Those were the main ones. And they also took a majority of seats on your board. Big
Wow.
mistake. That killed the
Wow.
company because we raised the money at the very beginning of the dot-com crash when the NASDAQ started to crash. And when that became more prolonged and worse than anyone anticipated, they wanted to pull the funding. And in fact, we found out they had never put all of that $3 million into our bank account. Remember, they were doing our finance. And this all
Yeah.
happened just in about 5 or 6 months. So we didn't have much visibility into the finances because it was just all new, right? And so they never fully funded us. And when the crash happened, they said, we want to shut the company down. And they had a majority of seats on the board. And so they did that. There's nothing we could do. But they were in breach of contract and we were in the right there. We could have sued them. So they preemptively sued us for fraud. So they got on the phone one day with us as a part of an official board meeting, shut the company down within like the first 10 seconds of the board meeting. And then we
Wow.
had process servers at the door of our office, like 10 minutes after that, serving us with papers. So they were intimidating us into walking away, and it worked. You know, we ended up settling for about 400,000. Most of that I had to pay out to vendors because we had started to scale up with their money, and then we had to pay out those vendors and settle things. But the very act of raising venture capital killed the company because in retrospect, knowing what I know now and with all the experience I have now, I could have bootstrapped that thing and I probably could have sold it for something. It may not have been a lot, maybe $1 million but I could have sold it and gotten some value out of that. And so I learned a lesson and I was determined to never raise venture capital again, to just stay away from that because what I learned is they're fickle. They don't care about your business. They don't care about your customers. They only care about their money. And if things go south, which sometimes they do, beyond your control, that was definitely beyond our control in terms of timing, they will pull the plug. They just don't care. And sometimes people ask me, but how can they do that? You know, if they have a contract, they have levers they can pull. If they have board seats, they can make your life miserable or pressure you to take the business in a direction that you don't think is going to be successful, or they can fire you perhaps as the CEO.
Yeah.
Or they can do what ours did, which was to, just decide we're not going to fund this thing and we're going to intimidate you into walking away.
Wow. That wouldn't have been easy for you, especially having a young family at the time. Do you want to tell us how your mindset was? How you I can only imagine the emotional roller coaster you would have gone through. Do you want to tell us a little bit more of your experience during this time? Their consistent bullying, so to say, towards you and your business. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your mindset and how you felt emotionally at this time?
Well, I was very angry. I have this thing about fairness and justice, which I've heard is an actual, almost like a gene. It's genetic. Things that are not fair or just drive me crazy. And I just am determined that they should be rectified. And as we know, they are often not rectified. Sometimes the bad guys win, which is a very common theme these days in the United States. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they win, and you can't destroy yourself or compromise your own happiness when that happens. But I was very unhappy about it. I was hugely angry. I was pregnant at the time with my second child.
Wow.
And he has quite a temper, and I often wonder, is it because he had to go through that literally inside my body with me? Because there were times where I would lie in my bed and just beat the mattress with my fists and scream because I was
Wow.
so frustrated that this happened, and it was so wrong, um, and so unfair. But I got through it, and I think it made me a lot more resilient as a person. It made me very clear-eyed about venture capital and the people who get into that business. I mean, they're not all terrible people, and they're not all as unscrupulous as the people that I came into contact with, but they're in it for the money. They
Yeah.
really don't care about you, your customers, or your business. They And that's not necessarily a bad thing because they're very clear about what they're in it for and what their business model is. So, and by the way, only 0.5% of entrepreneurs ever raise venture. So why do we talk about it so much? Why is it the end all be all? I happen to think it's because that's what all the media focuses on. But
Yeah.
there's a whole world of entrepreneurship that just exists completely outside of Silicon Valley and the Golden Triangle, and um, entrepreneurs making life-changing amounts of money for themselves and building amazing companies and teams. And you don't hear those stories, but that's what I'm really enjoying about my new chapter now is I talk to these people all the time. And that's where the subhead of my book came from, because tech entrepreneurs, even here in San Francisco, have a bad reputation because they often
Yeah.
behave very badly and come from a place of greed and arrogance. And but the reality is, because I see it every day, there are more people like me and my peers building businesses and teams. So it's actually a wonderful ecosystem and a huge economic engine in every country. And I just wish more stories like mine were told. And so that's why I wrote the book. That's why I do what I do now, which is getting out and talking to groups of entrepreneurs and finding out what they're up to. So I can then use my platform to share their stories also.
I love that. Do you as well as educate and sharing your story, do you angel and invest in other promising startups as well?
I haven't done any angel investing, but I am an LP at a venture fund that's run by women, and that one of their things that they do is they make sure that all the companies they invest in has at least one woman on the founding team. And they invest in deep tech and health tech and robotics and things like that. So all kind of very high tech companies. And that's my way of kind of putting my money where my mouth is. And, I am very financially transparent. I made a video, which is how I built my social media platform, that breaks down my deal and exactly how much money I walked away with and how much I paid in taxes and all of the details. And, and I made another video after that because there were so many questions like, what are you spending your money on? You made all this money. But in the second video, I reveal how my finances were completely decimated by my startup journey, because I didn't save for retirement for 10 years and I underpaid myself or didn't pay myself at all for a long time. So I had a lot of debt when I sold the company. And so, 2.5 million of what I made went boom out the door. I
Wow.
had to practically rebuild my home because I had 20 years of my home, which was over 100 years old, being trashed by pets and children. So I, put a lot of money into my home. I built an apartment in my basement because I knew my elderly mother was going to be moving in with us. I had a second home, which was like a cabin that burned in a wildfire, burned completely. So it was insured, but when you rebuild, you typically spend more than than you got for the insurance. So there were like two huge construction projects, a second mortgage, a line of credit, and all of this was really the result of living beyond my means and not saving for retirement. And that was the cost of my entrepreneurial journey, because we took a long time to get to where we could pay ourselves well.
Wow. Wow. So in terms of the tax and how much did you actually walk away from them with the 25 million buyout of your company, exit of your company?
I walked away with 13 million, and I paid about 4 million in taxes. So yeah, 9 million.
Excellent. Excellent. And now my question now, we've spoke about how you had Frigid, you had members of your families on the board, you were had investment from these venture capitalists, which turned out, in actual fact, to be a horrible experience. And then at the start of the conversation, you said that now gave birth to Boardroom Insiders. Do you want to talk us through that journey? You said it was like a spin-off to now Boardroom Insiders. How did that happen?
Yeah, I after the implosion of Fidget, I had my second son, and then 9/11 happened a few months
Yeah.
after that. So the Bay Area was reeling not only from the dot-com crash of 2000, but now, it's just starting to maybe start to recover. And then you have 9/11. And so there were no jobs, and I needed a job. We had a mortgage and we needed health insurance. And so I took the worst job I've ever had. It was a ridiculous job. And there's a whole chapter on it in my book because it's too long to go into here. But the point is it made me determined to never, ever work for anyone ever again. And so what I did after leaving that job, I only lasted 6 months. I did a massive email to everyone I know and everyone my husband knew. And I said, I'm open for business as a freelancer. Here are the things I'm good at, but I'll pretty much do anything. And my first job was, my husband had a friend who had a specialty foods company, and he used to do private label sauces, pasta sauces for brands like Williams Sonoma and other well-known brands. And his wife was about to have a baby, and he said, he said, I know you can cook well. I've been to your house for dinner. Can you take these 3 recipes and make sample sauces for Williams Sonoma? So that was my first job as a freelancer, and I got paid $200 to do all the shopping, all the cooking, sterilizing the jars, packaging everything up. And I ended up doing things more in my field. I got some kind of PR writing jobs and various writing jobs. But then a man who had been my assistant at the startup, the localization startup that I worked at, he contacted me and he said, I'm working for this event marketing agency now. We have this big opportunity with Intel. And he said, why don't you come and work with me on it? And I said, I don't even know anything about that. I said, I know nothing about trade shows and I know nothing about Intel or tech. And he said, oh, come on, you'll be fine. You're going to be great. So I started working with him on these big trade shows for companies like Intel and PeopleSoft, which was acquired by Oracle, and lots of big tech companies. And that's when I got into big tech marketing. And he and I were a duo for a number of years, like 4 or 5 years. It was just the two of us working on these big projects. And then gradually his teams grew, and I was part of his team, but as a freelancer. And every time he moved to another company, I would go with him. And so in a very short period of time, I developed this event marketing expertise within big tech. And once they started talking about how do we access the C-suite, how do we talk to the C-suite, I very quickly developed that expertise and a methodology and some frameworks for what I would provide to clients to help them prepare for these meetings. And in a very short period of time, I became like the go-to person in big tech for C-suite sales and marketing strategy. And I was working with almost all of the big names around this. It was very lucrative. And that's how I got the idea for Boardroom Insiders. You know, if I can just, as I said earlier, I realized all of the big tech companies were chasing the same 2,500 people. And so all I needed to do was get those 2,500 people covered in a database and keep it updated. And I would have a subscription product. Now, it wasn't easy. It wasn't that easy at all, but that was the vision, and it ended up working. It just took a lot longer. And I think the reason it took a lot longer is because I was working with all the huge tech companies. So it was a very rarefied client set. And what I didn't realize is that it was going to take another 5 or 6 years for the next level of tech companies down the chain to catch on and want to do the same thing. So I was kind of stuck for a while without a big enough market because we were ahead of the market. But the market did catch up. And once it did, we kind of owned that market. So it was easier to sell into tech at that point.
Fantastic. So just to break it down to us and to our audience, you have a lot of tech startups wanting to sell to larger organizations. And usually the people to speak to or the decision makers are the C-suite executives, CEO, CFO, CTO, right?
Not
always. Not always.
Not always, but it was really more big tech companies selling. Later, it became the smaller ones, but in the beginning, it was Salesforce, it was Cisco, it was HP, SAP, Oracle. Those were the ones that we were working with, and they were the pioneers of this C-suite selling. And and really, Sun was the first one I worked with on this. Sun was a company with deep Bay Area roots, and a CEO named Scott McNeely. And he was smart enough to realize that he needed to sell into the C-suite. And even though he was a household name in the Bay Area, he knew that, the chief information officer of Procter & Gamble or Progressive Insurance, they didn't know who he was. So he needed to understand who they were before he made a phone call so that he could reference something that would give him credibility and allow him to get his foot in the door. So the first profiles I did were for him and his executive team specifically.
Wow. That makes perfect sense. So that's basically if somebody wanted to get into a decision maker in a company, and they basically go to you to ask, could you tell me about so-and-so company? What are they looking for? What information do I need that could help me sell this product? And you become that go-to person that everybody wants to get to in order to get into some of these companies that require this tech software or data.
Yes, and it was a very bespoke deliverable. I was creating these on demand from customers, and they took a long time to create. and they had to be formatted beautifully. So my husband had a graphic design background, so I would do all the content and he would format them. And I did about 200 of these for Scott McNeely's team, and they paid $1,000 each in 2006.
Wow.
So my vision was like, if he's paying me $1,000 per profile, if I could get them into a database and sell them for 200 a profile over and over and over and over again, that would be phenomenal, because I owned all the content. I mean, it was copyrighted under Boardroom Insiders. The
Wow.
framework and the template was mine. So even though Sun was paying me to do them, I owned all of that content. And that was an important thing that I did, to copyright all of that, even though I was being paid to do it by somebody else.
That's amazing. And so for back then, were you still operate, even though you hadn't really introduced tech just yet, were you still considered Boardroom Insiders as well?
No,
or you were just a freelancer at the time?
I was a freelancer, and I had, I think it was August 2008. So I was doing this for McNeely, I think in 2006. August 2008 is when I officially started Boardroom Insiders, and I came up with, the name, and got the domain name, and incorporated and did all of the legal paperwork, and started doing my copyright and trademarks and all of that, all of those details. So this was a very, and I tell entrepreneurs this all the time, because particularly younger people who don't have a lot of work experience but want to do something entrepreneurial, they'll say, well, how do I come up with my idea? And what I see is most entrepreneurs who exist, down in the not the unicorn, and not the venture capital backed, but in the space where I operate, bootstrapped, relatively small. We get our ideas from our own industries that we've been working in for a long time. And I always tell them, get a job, look around and listen to what people complain about, your coworkers, what drives them crazy, where's the friction in the processes within your industry and your company, and then dive into that and consider whether you could come up with a solution and take that friction and that pain away. And if people would be willing to pay for it. So you're looking for a problem in your industry or workplace, and then you're trying to figure out, is this enough of a problem that people would be willing to pay for a solution? And then can I come up with a solution? So that's really what I was doing for a number of years. If I started this all back in like 2006, and I didn't start the company until 2008, and I didn't have any real customers probably until like 2010 and 11. I mean, I had some customers, but not like the types of customers I wanted. And then it didn't really take off. The market didn't catch up to us until about 2016. So this was a 10-year project to get us to where we really were a viable company. And it all was born out of work that I was doing very successfully and that was very lucrative. And in fact, I kept consulting until like 2014.
Wow.
So I had one, because I had to, and it was a bone of contention with me and my partner, because I was doing a lot of custom projects for our early customers, because our product, frankly, wasn't robust enough to solve their problem completely. They needed a lot of custom work. And so I would do that. And so what they were doing was paying us for custom work, not database subscriptions, which means we weren't getting the annual recurring revenue, which is the holy grail that sets you up to have a good exit. Exits, multiples it's on multiples of ARR. or annual recurring revenue. And so,
Revenue.
he would say, we need the ARR, Sharon, like, where's the subscription in this deal? And I'd say, don't worry, we're going to get them. We just have to show them the value first. We have
Yeah.
to, and it was true. It was like so many companies, even the biggest ones with the most sophisticated marketing teams, did not know how to use our information. So often it wasn't just about providing them with the information, it was then creating a whole deck that showed them all these different ways they could use it, down to I would write emails from our
Wow.
customer's chief marketing officer to the chief information officer of the company they were targeting. I would write the emails for them based on what we saw in the profile, or I would design a whole 2-day event down to describing the sessions and who should be speaking and what they should be talking about. I would do all that work and we would get paid very well for it. I mean, sometimes we get paid like $25,000, $30,000 for one of those projects. And it kept us alive as a company. And it also taught the customers how to use the information so that they would be confident enough to then get a subscription. Because if you think the information is great, but you don't know what to do with it, then you're not going to be able to get the value out of it. So it was critical in those early years that we educate the market about what C-suite selling was and C-suite engagement, why it was important, and how you do it and the different ways you can do it. Because it's not a one and done. You don't just write one email to a CIO and get a deal. You have to build that relationship over time, sometimes, years, by providing consistent respect, value, and showing them that you know them, that you know something about them. And, one important point is back then, the internet did not have as much information
No.
available on companies and people as it does now. So this
Yeah.
information was actually very difficult to find. And we read earnings call transcripts to come up with the business initiatives and challenges sections of the profile. And that's very hard work, and it requires a tremendous level of business acumen. Because even today, if you're trying to get in touch with a chief marketing officer and you want to understand what their initiatives are, you may not be able to find a single interview with that person. Maybe they don't have a big digital profile. But if you read the earnings call transcript and what the CEO is saying, you can usually find something in those remarks that ties directly to their marketing strategy. And you can connect the dots for the customer by saying, the CEO has said this about their digital marketing spend, and you can put that right in the CMO's profile, even though you don't have a single thing on her. So
Yeah.
we needed to hire people who could quickly read through an earnings call transcript and say, this goes here, this goes in the CIO's profile, this goes in the CFO's profile, this goes in the CEO profile. And so our content was highly differentiated across roles within the same company.
Fantastic. You mentioned about when you speak to young entrepreneurs about finding a need, they should go out into the workplace and see what frictions they can find in the workplace. And you mentioned that you worked as a freelancer with your assistant doing all of these trade shows. I'm guessing from your interaction on these trade shows, you kept hearing more and more of the same problems, which now gave birth to Boardroom Insiders, right? Excellent.
Yes.
And in your discussion now, you've kind of mentioned what some of those pain points. Do you want to elaborate on any of them?
Yeah. In the event world, events and trade shows are one of the main ways at the time, and still are, for tech companies to connect with customers and prospects and market their products and launch new products and educate customers and prospects. And they put a ton of money into those events, millions and millions of dollars. And attendees tend to be mostly customers, and they go to learn and learn what's new, learn how to better use the products, troubleshoot problems that they're having, and they go to network with their peers, right? And so as the decision-making power for some of these tech deals was moving up and up and up the executive chain, suddenly these companies are like, well, how can we attract VPs, SVPs, and C-levels to our events? Because typically the people who go to the events are like, director level, senior director or below that. They're the hands-on users of the product. And so the challenge for these companies was a CIO is not going to go to Dreamforce and walk around the trade show floor. I mean, some might, but typically they're not going to do that. That's like below their pay grade, right? They want to be able to pick up the phone and talk to the CTO of Salesforce rather than go wandering around, right? So all these companies were saying, how can we attract the C-level to our events? And so they started experimenting with things like a special half-day Chief Information Officer Summit that happens at the same time as Dreamforce, but is often a very fancy location that's nearby. And, they might bus them in and give them VIP seats for Mark Benioff's keynote, and maybe they go backstage with Benioff, who's the CEO. But the rest of the time, they're at a fancy hotel, just in a small ballroom, talking with each other, because that's what they really want. And I did a whole bunch of research at the time. I happened to know a guy who worked directly for the CTO of Cisco. And so I did a project where I interviewed a bunch of very high level people at big tech companies about what does the C-suite want? Like, why do they go to events? What events will they go to? And so I developed an informed point of view of how you could get C-level people to your event. And so that became part of my consulting practice. And it just fed right into Boardroom Insiders because, one of the premises is if you're going to get these people to an event, you need to make the event about them, not you. And in order to make it about them, you have to understand who they are and what they care about. And that's where my dossiers came into play. So everything I was doing was kind of revolving around the product that I was trying to build and leading me to get more insight into my target customers, really prove out the product market fit, which is what a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with. And that's why I say, if you can, my preferred method of starting something is to start something in the field you're already working in and keep your day job for as long as you possibly can. And if you run into competitive issues with being a full-time employee, become a consultant to that same industry. Keep your contacts, keep working with them, because that's exactly what I did. I was a consultant, so I was free to take on the projects I wanted to take on and decline those that had nothing to do with Boardroom Insiders, because I was doing consulting that had nothing to do with C-suite selling. And at a certain point, I dropped that. It became not so much about the money I was making. It came about like, I need to focus. I need to focus only on C-level sales and marketing projects. And I told my clients that, and they didn't like it. They didn't like me putting up those boundaries, and they pushed back. And in fact, one person brought her boss, a big boss, into a meeting with me after I had already declined a specific project. And she said in front of her boss, "Sharon's going to do this project for us. Isn't that great?" And then I had to do it because she had told
No
the big
way.
boss. And she totally bamboozled me into doing a project. I mean, that's how I was a great consultant. And that became an issue. And what happened is some of my best consulting clients were some of the last people to buy into Boardroom Insiders because they didn't want me doing Boardroom Insiders. They wanted me doing what I had always done for them. And they didn't see me as a software entrepreneur, as a SaaS entrepreneur. They saw me as this consultant that did all their PowerPoint decks. And
stay in your lane.
that's they want you to stay in your lane. And when that's the one, I think, downside to starting something in your own field is you might have to go away from the very people that supported you while you were developing your ideas, because they want you to stay doing what you're doing. If you're good, they want you to keep doing it. It's a blessing and a curse, actually, because I made a lot of money doing that work, but it was very hard to break free, and it was hard to give up that money and, go from, making well into the six figures to making hardly anything.
That's amazing. That's amazing. We've come to the creme de la creme now that I want to ask you. And really, where I want to have a conversation is your transition into a consultancy, into a SaaS business model, a recurring revenue generating business. Whilst you're sleeping, you're still generating. Now, with somebody, I'm assuming, with little or no tech background, how did you start? Who did you connect with? Did you have a mentor? Did you have the right people at the right places? Was it scary now for you to go into an environment that you were unknown for? It was totally new territories for yourself. Please go ahead. Sorry, I have a tendency to keep throwing so many things out there, but it's pretty much the same thing. Walk us through the journey from the consultancy to starting it as a software as a service business.
Well, I built a database of flat PDFs. So it wasn't a real database. It was a database in that I had a bunch of files in it, but they were flat PDF profiles that my husband had formatted. That was fairly easy to build and inexpensive. And the problem was you had to keep these things updated. Earnings calls happen 4 times a year, and people move from one company to another, and you have to update their profile. So the updating was painful. I would have to, create a Word file of the new content, give that to my husband. He would reformat the whole thing, upload the new PDF to replace the old profile, right? So it wasn't a true database subscription product for a long time. And back then it was much more expensive to build those types of products than it is today. That's one thing that's in people's advantage today, is that you can just build it yourself if you have a little bit of knowledge. You don't have to be technical. But back then you had to hire developers. And so I hired, well, first of all, I needed money to build the database. I didn't really have enough money to do that. And so I had a conversation with this friend of our family who had just exited his company. He made millions of dollars. And I didn't pose it as like, do you want to invest type of conversation? I just said, what do you think of this idea? And it was like a 10-minute conversation. And at the end of it, he said, go build your database. I'll write you a check for $125,000 for 10% of the company. And I said, okay. And so he was my angel. And I was terrified of losing his money. And I, with Fidget, I had bootstrapped for a long time until we raised the venture capital. So I'm a really good bootstrapper. I didn't grow up with a lot of money, right? So I'm good at stretching a dollar. And so I used that money, part of it, to build the database. I think I spent $25,000, and it built a proper database where I could go into a profile and all the data was fielded. So I could update one little data point while keeping the others, and add things in like dates, so that you could map relationships. So as the database grew, I could map relationships and say, hey, wait a minute, these two people were at General Motors at the same time, and they have the same keywords in their titles at the same time. So maybe they knew each other while they were at GM. So started to add some richness to the product with relationship mapping. And, kept, I think that cost like $25K. So then I had $100K left to just pay some of my contractors who were helping scale up the content. And, but the sales effort wasn't going great. I had some early customers who would find me online and they thought it was amazing. They were big fans of the product, but I couldn't charge that much for it because I didn't have all the profiles they needed. So they would have to order new profiles, which I would produce sometimes literally overnight myself. And so it was still this heavy kind of made to order component to the product for a very long time. I took on a partner in 2011. And one of the most critical junctures in our whole business was after he had been with me for a few months, he said, you know what, Sharon, he's like, I can't sell this product if we can't tell people what's in it. And we don't have a way of describing the profiles that we have. They're just random. I think we had 600 profiles at that time. He said, we've got a lot of CIOs. CIOs is really where we started, the chief information officers. But we've also got some CEOs and we've also got some CMOs. So I can't sell it if I can't describe accurately what's in it. So what we decided to do was build a box of data, put a box around it is how he described it. And we decided to build out the Fortune 500 top 5 C-levels in every company. So these were not business line heads. They were the C-suite within the corporate structure.
Yeah.
CIO, CEO, CMO, COO, CFO. And so that's what we built in the summer of 2011. And when we did that, we took a little bit more money from two of his friends and a little bit more money from Michael, because Michael always told me, if you ever take more money, I want to put more in because I always want to own 10% of the company. I don't know why he wanted that, but that's what he told me. And I always remembered that. And so we raised a total of about 200,000, a little bit more. And that's all we ever raised. And once we had that box of data, that's when we became more viable from a sales perspective and started getting some significant deals and were able to start paying ourselves something. And, and our pay was very, it was $2,000 a month each. And then it became $3,000 a month each. And it literally ticked up very slowly until we were making more of a market rate salaries.
That's amazing. And so you began to scale the business. For the investors, the angel investors, what was their percentage share in the business?
Together, the angels had about 13% of the business. And so they got, I just did the math recently, they got an 11 times return on their money, which is, that's in the range of what VCs would want, right?
That's amazing. And that happened in a space of about 10 years, right?
It was, 11. Well, for Michael, it was 14 years from his initial investment. But from the 2011, it was like, it was about 10 years.
That is absolutely amazing. You mentioned that you love to bootstrap. What were the biggest challenges bootstrapping and growing the business without the involvement of venture capital?
You have a lot of things that you want to do, but you can't afford to do it yet. A lot of them are experimental. You don't know if they're going to work or not, but you'd like to try them. And so sometimes you have an idea that you would like to do for years, and you can't do it until, years later. The software that we built on top of our database, I sketched it all out in 2016. but we didn't have the money to build it until 2019. And once we launched that thing in 2019, I mean, we were selling it even before we launched it. I knew it would be
Wow.
amazing and a game changer, but we couldn't afford to build it. And not only could we not, even when we got to the point where we could have afforded to build it, we didn't have the right technology partner. It was very hard being non-technical to find the right technology partner. And we kissed a lot of frogs, so to speak. And some of the people we worked with, like we worked with this one guy, a single person out of Austin for years, and he was great, but we outgrew him. We needed more support than he could give because he had a day job. And also, he kind of aged out in terms of his skill set. Our original site was in PHP, and that became very brittle. And, we ended up hiring a firm that rebuilt our whole site on Ruby on Rails. And
Wow.
boy, did that make a huge difference in being able to launch new features and tweak the product so quickly. We were rolling out improvements, at least once a week, if not more, at a certain point once we got the site rebuilt. So those were some of the challenges. And when you did experiment with something and it failed, it would be painful because it could cost, $5,000 to try something, and it would fail and poof, there goes the money, and that's money we could have put in our own pockets and that we desperately needed at the time. But, we just had to keep going. I personally like checking experiments off my list once I find out they don't work, because then I don't lie in bed at night thinking about what if,
Yeah.
and knowing why they fail is important so that you don't do something similar in the future. At one point we thought we were hearing from customers, particularly in big tech, sometimes their sales and marketing teams are very verticalized. So, you have healthcare marketing and sales, you have oil and gas, retail, right? And so we were finding that there were companies that were very interested, or teams that were very interested in our product, but they didn't need the whole Fortune 500. They just needed the healthcare vertical. So there was a point where we kind of separated out batches of data in a vertical way so that they could just buy that piece. And they still didn't buy it. It didn't work. And it was a pain to administer. So that was another experiment that we did that didn't work. But over time, you do things that actually do work. And I would say there are few game-changing things that software was definitely a game changer for us, but earlier improvements we made were less about game changing and more about just like giving us a little bit more traction. And those add up over time and improve your, your close rate with customers, or your ability to get people interested in the product as you make those little tweaks. For example, we introduced a very robust filtering system because as our database grew, we had a lot of profiles in there that were outside of the Fortune 500 because customers could request new ones. And so we introduced a Fortune 500 filter, a filter by title, a filter by region, a filter by gender, because a lot of companies in big tech were starting to do events for female executives only, as women execs became like an important affinity group. Or some sales teams were just focused on a certain region, so they needed to be able to filter everything out and just focus on the people who were in companies in that region. So these were all little improvements we made along the way.
That Sharon, I just looked at the time and I've enjoyed the conversation so much that I've lost track of time, right? Do you mind if I ask just a few more questions? I'll try to be as quickly as
Go
possible
ahead.
because I think that your journey has been absolutely amazing. It's an inspiring conversation to have, and I know it would inspire a lot of our audience. Now, we've talked a lot about your background. Tell me how you felt, or tell me the journey, the moment you are about to exit, from the phone call you received, from somebody showing you interest, to signing the paper, to seeing the money into your bank account. Tell me about, and your emotional roller coaster that went through it. Maybe you were sad because you've been carrying this baby for so long, and now all of a sudden that is gone. I would love to hear a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, and it's the opening chapter of my book. I'm on the airplane when the deal closes because one thing about my company that we haven't talked about is I'm here in San Francisco, but my whole company grew up in South Carolina, in a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina, because that's where my partner was. And he was the owner of, the sales department, which was where a lot of our first hires were. So the office, we had a physical office, but it all grew up in South Carolina. And meanwhile, I'm back here in my home in San Francisco, but I would go out there about once a month, sometimes more often. And when I was out there in April of 2021, we got a call from a private equity firm that had reached out to us during the pandemic. During the pandemic, deals kind of went, VCs and also private equity firms started to look down market for smaller companies because they didn't do a lot of deals during the pandemic and they had to deploy all this money somewhere, right? So we had talked to this private equity firm a few times during the pandemic, and they had looked at our financials at the time, and they had said, we're going to pass, but we'd like to check in with you like every 6 months to see how you're doing. So I was with my partner in South Carolina in April of 21, and we got a call from this firm, and they said, how's everything going? And I said, everything is fantastic. We are having great fun running the business. It's going great. And we're just going to keep our heads down for now. And they said, well, that's too bad because we could give you a term sheet for 48 million today. And I went, what? Because we had talked to over the years, a lot of these folks, we call them tire kickers. Like, you don't take it too seriously or get too excited about it. But that was the first time anyone had ever thrown out a number. And when you have a company like we did, I mean, the valuations can be all over the place. You don't know if you can sell it for 5 million or 50 million. I mean, the range is really that big in terms of what's possible, depending on the market conditions as well, and depending on how well your business is doing and how fast it's growing. So, as the head of the business, I felt it was my responsibility to look into this and not just ignore it. And so I told my partner, I said, we have to think about this and take this seriously. But I didn't know anything about the M&A process, the mergers and acquisitions process. I didn't really understand the difference between private equity and VC and M&A banker. Like, that just wasn't my background. And I just had not ever put any focus on that because I was too busy focused on the business. And so I ran out into the hallway so that my employees couldn't hear. And I called Michael, my original angel. In the years since Michael exited his first company, he exited more companies and he invested in companies. And he is now a public company CEO. He's done an IPO. So at the time, he was preparing for that IPO, but he just loves the deal, right? So he would take my calls. And I said, Michael, we talked to this PE firm and they threw out 48 million. He said, they're full of shit, Sharon. He's like, they're not serious. They're going to throw out a number and get you all excited. And then when you go through due diligence, they're going to find things that they're going to say, well, we're going to chip away at the valuation. He said, they'll get you down to 20 and then you'll be so exhausted, you'll take it. He said, don't negotiate with a single buyer. Hire a banker and run a process. So I went back to my partner's office. My partner has more of a banking background. And I said, what's a process and what's an M&A banker? And he explained it to me. And he said, it's not that complicated. It's like hiring a realtor, but instead of selling your house, they're selling your business. They look at your business, they tell you what's wrong with it, what could cause you to get a lower valuation or a higher. They create a marketing deck, they create demand, competition, and sell your business for you, and you pay them a percentage fee. And so I understood that. I didn't think that was that complicated. And then he said to me, you have the most to win or lose from this transaction, so you need to run it, because I had 57% of the equity. And so that's what I did. And it wasn't that hard to learn. There's a lot of gatekeeping and jargon around this kind of deal making. And it's really the number part where they dig into the numbers. That's very complicated and way over my head, frankly. But the process is not that complicated. It's very straightforward and very similar to selling your house, just a lot harder to do and more complicated.
Yeah.
But so we got referrals to bankers. Together with my partner, we interviewed all the bankers and got it down to a short list of 3. Then they pitched us. And then I asked to talk to 3 to 4 references from each of them of, entrepreneurs who had sold using their services in the last 2 years. And that was the most valuable use of my time, talking to those other entrepreneurs. I talked to 12, I think, entrepreneurs who had sold their companies. Some sold to PE firms, some sold to strategic investors, and they had wildly different experience levels with finance and with transactions. Most of them had not sold before. Some of them were the type of people who keep all their records all over their house in shoe boxes. So due diligence was a horror show for them. Others were, very sophisticated in how they keep their records digitally. And so I learned a ton from those conversations. I took copious notes, and then I did a debrief with my partner on all of it. And based on those conversations, we chose a banker, and we launched our process in early September of 21, and it was done by January 21st, I think, 22. So it was about 4 months from hire to wire, as they say. And
Wow.
I thought the process was fun. Like, I was invigorated by it. I thought it was exciting and fun, but it did get quite painful, like the last 2 to 3 weeks. And that was very difficult. And the closing was delayed several times, which is not good, because anything can happen that's beyond your control. There could be a terrorist attack, there could be a stock market crash, or you could lose some big customers unexpectedly, and any one of those things can tank your deal. And so the bankers know this, and so the bankers push for, to get that deal closed. That's really what you hire them to do, is to make sure that it closes. And they also shield you from a lot of the drama that's going on behind the scenes. Like, at one point we did have, in December of 21, there were a number of big deals that we were expecting to come in like October, November, and they didn't close, like huge consequential deals. And so unbeknownst to us, the buyer put a pause on the deal for like a week. And we didn't even know that it was happening.
The bank
But
didn't
then
inform you?
no, they didn't inform us. They said, just keep us updated on any key client wins. And so a couple of those deals did end up closing like December 9th or something. And after that, everything got restarted. And it was only after that. And I remember I was like, around the 19th of December, I was in Jamaica for a 50th birthday party. And that's when the banker told me, like, the deal did get paused for about a week, and we didn't tell you because part of our job is to shield you from the stress and the drama. And, he said, it's a good thing those deals came in. And so, there was absolutely no consequence to the pause, except that it got pushed out a little bit. But towards the end, it seemed like the buyer was just pumping the brakes, not because they didn't want to do the deal, but because they weren't ready to receive our team. They weren't ready to take over yet. And so there was some delays, and it got a bit stressful and a little heated. So that's why I flew home, because we were supposed to close on a Friday, and then we were supposed to close on a Tuesday, and then on a Wednesday. And then on Thursday, I'm like, I'm going home. I've been in South Carolina for 2 weeks. My luggage had been lost, so I was wearing the same outfit for 4 days. I'm like, I got to get home. So there was another event it was supposed to close the day I was flying home, right? But it was supposed to close before I got on the plane. It was supposed to close at 9:30 in the morning. I was boarding the plane at 10:30, and the plane was leaving at like 11, and at 11 it still hadn't closed, and I had heard no reason why. I hadn't even heard from them. So I was sitting there on the plane not knowing what was going to happen. And when you take off, you don't have Wi-Fi for maybe like the first 20 minutes or something. I had been upgraded to first class because I flew so much that I often got upgraded. So that was nice. And I was sitting there with a glass of champagne when I got pinged finally, when the Wi-Fi came on, that the deal had closed. Actually, the Wi-Fi came on and it still hadn't closed. It didn't close till about 12:30 local time. So I was on the plane for about an hour and a half before I got that message. And that was crazy, because you want to jump up and down and scream and yell, but you can't. You're in a plane full of people. And so I texted my husband that it was done, and I said, watch our bank account, because how it works is once it closes, it's like they push a button and the money just gets wired and it hits your account pretty much within, a half an hour. So $10 million hit our bank account. And we owed, we were doing all these construction projects on our house. We owed like $100K to some family members. We owed like $90K in credit card debt. We had a $400K line of credit that was maxed out due to the construction. So he paid off all of that even before I walked in the door from flying home. So that was an amazing feeling, having all of that debt instantly vanish and seeing that money. Like I said, I had not saved for retirement in 10 years. I would not have been able to retire probably ever. And so it was surreal, but I was exhausted. And I walked in the door, and because I'd been wearing these clothes for 4 days, I just threw the clothes on the floor and took a hot bath, came out of the bath, and my sister-in-law happened to be visiting. My sister-in-law, who kind of launched my whole entrepreneurial career, was visiting from LA. And she was just like, don't you want to have some champagne or something? I was so tired. I was just exhausted. And so I didn't even have any champagne. Like, we dug around in the refrigerator, and I found a cheap can of sparkling rosé. And so we split it. And I had, my hair in a towel. My hair was wet. And then I got a FaceTime from my team in South Carolina. And, I was always very professional on meetings, like, hair and makeup done. And here I have wet hair and looking horrible. And then they were all drunk in a bar, because we did give some phantom equity to our team. So people made anywhere from, the newest members of the team made maybe like 5K, and the people who'd been with us for a long time made a lot more than that, 6 figures. And so everybody was celebrating. And at that moment I thought, oh, I wish I had stayed back there, because that would have been fun. But, so it wasn't the thing that it didn't go how you would expect, to be on a plane after I'd been waiting there for 2 weeks and it finally closes when I'm on the plane. But it made for a good story anyway.
That's amazing. And I even think it's befitting that you got the news holding a glass of champagne in your hand.
Yeah, and then I asked for a second one and a third. So maybe that's why I didn't want any champagne when I got home. So I had already had too much. But the but you asked about, the feeling, because the buyer didn't tell us until a few days before that they were not going to have me and my partner continue. We kept asking, but they kept putting off telling us what their plans were. And so they finally said, a few days before we closed, they said, we're going to give you both 3-month consulting agreements and then phase you out of the business. But the reality is they had us phased out within about 3 weeks, and they had limited us to working like 10 hours a week. So it wasn't that much time at all that we had with our team. And so that was hard for me. I think for my partner, he was thrilled because, he was actually sitting in South Carolina managing the physical office, which
Yeah.
means he was dealing with, weird things that people do in the office or people's problems that come up. And for him, that was quite draining. So he was exhausted, and it wasn't, it was his baby, but not in the sense that it was mine. It was my idea, my vision, something that was born out of work I had been doing for a very long time and that I was very passionate about. And
Yeah.
so it was a lot harder of an adjustment for me. And I cried for like a month, but I couldn't talk to anybody about it outside of my family because nobody wants to hear a millionaire crying. And so it was a very strange time. And then even after I kind of got over it, which took me about a month, and I realized it's best that I'm not there because they were an old guard company that bought us. It was a public British company, been around for many decades, and they just weren't nimble like we were. And I had never worked in a corporate environment before of that size. And when I started to see how they operated, I mean, it was fine. They weren't doing anything wrong, but it just wasn't for me. When I talked before about the merger in my previous startup where
Yeah.
it just, everything came with friction all of a sudden. Like even like the email they set up for me, and it's like the firewalls and all that. I'm like, oh my God, this is just not something that would make me, I can't operate this way. So it was ultimately was for the best, but it was a painful transition. And then even after I got over it, there was this period of like, I guess I'm retired, but I'm not I don't really like that. And so then I had to
Yeah.
figure out, well, what am I going to do? And that was very hard. And I'm still going through that process. I would say I'm like halfway down the funnel of, I entered this funnel with like, I could do everything from getting a big job to starting another company to consulting and I've tossed some of those ideas and I'm about halfway down that funnel, but I'm still defining what am I doing now.
That's it.
It's a hard
I,
process.
I, I love the story. And you're still in the process of working that out, aren't you?
Yeah, and you can't rush it. What I've learned is you can't rush it. You can't force it because you have to, and it's the same thing that happened with anything I've ever done. If you get out there and just talk to enough people, share your story, hear their story, hear what's going on in the market, hear what people are struggling with, it will lead you to where you need to go. But you can't fast track that. You have to do the work. And that work is talking to people, researching what's happening, listening to people, a lot of listening, and listening to what people are asking for. I was such a generalist in my company. Like, I can't build a go-to-market strategy. I can't do your finance projections. I can't develop your marketing strategy, or probably the closest functional expertise I have is now in product, which is weird because I have no formal training in that, but I did build an amazing product. Um,
Yeah.
So maybe I could work on your product, but I felt like I'm not equipped to really do anything. But then I started telling my story in a few places, and people started coming out of the woodwork to talk to me. Can we talk? Can we talk? And the more I talk to people, the more I realize, like, I know a lot more than I think I do. Like, when you do something for so long, you just think everybody knows what you know. You don't think it's
Yeah.
special, the knowledge you have. But I started to see that people really wanted more information. In fact, they couldn't get enough. They wanted more stories or they wanted more advice. And particularly because everything that I have done and that I believe goes completely against conventional wisdom and all the stories you hear in the press, because it's really a bunch of BS, frankly.
Yeah.
Because it goes back to, it applies to this sliver that is so rarefied. We have a better chance of getting hit by lightning than building the next Facebook or whatever that is that's written about in the press, or being the next Elon Musk, right? But we actually do have a chance of being the next Sharon Gillenwater, or, someone who builds a $2 million startup and sells it for 10 million, or a $5 million startup and sells it for 25 million. And so there was just this hunger for more information and more contact with me and more advice. And so that's how I got to the point of writing the book. And I'm spending a lot of time and my own money traveling around speaking to groups of entrepreneurs. And I also do kind of, I'm trying to describe the kind of coaching I do. It's almost like troubleshooting and working sessions for entrepreneurs. So once one of my videos, my money video talking about how much money I made, went viral, I got inundated. And I was doing calls all day long, but not getting paid for it. So I said, okay. And some of the calls were not serious. So I put up a Calendly link with a paywall, pay me $300 to talk to me for an hour. And I list out very specifically the things I know a lot about, because I don't want someone to come to me and say, how can I raise venture? Because, I don't know. I don't even recommend that, right? In most cases. So, and then I had the entrepreneur send me some material in advance, and I spend maybe 20 minutes researching them. And then we get on the call and I say, okay, what do you want to dive into? And we do like a deep dive working session where we brainstorm ideas for addressing the challenges that they're facing. And it was a scary thing for me to do, because if someone's going to pay me $300, I want to make sure they get a lot of value, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it's been very successful. And it's so much fun for me, because it's a lot of women mainly who are in a very similar situation that I was in when I was consulting. They have developed some expertise in an area and they become indispensable to a group of clients, and they're getting paid well, and they want to turn what they do into a SaaS platform.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I've done. And so I have tons of advice for them, and they seem to find it very valuable. And some of them book with me like once a month or every 6 weeks. So that is, that's working for me. The speaking is working for me. And now I'm trying to figure out um, what's my business model? How do I get paid for doing all the stuff that I'm doing? Right. Because,
Yeah.
I have money. I can continue to do it for free and cover my travel, but I don't have the kind of money where, you know, I can overspend on that type of stuff.
Yeah.
Right. Um, because I spent so much right when I made it, because I was making up for a lot of pent up expenses. So I'm thinking about things like, I talk in my book about all the tools I used. And when I talk to entrepreneurs, I talk about all the tools I use, whether it's Gusto, Slack, HubSpot, Calendly, all these tools. And it's like, I think that they should sponsor me to go and do talks for groups of entrepreneurs, because I'm talking mainly to bootstrappers and early stage entrepreneurs. And I don't really want to, I don't want them paying me. I want someone else paying me who wants access to them. So
Yeah.
I'm toying with ideas like that. Is there some way that I could be sponsored, excuse me, to go out and educate people?
Absolutely. I think one of the things we'll do, and this is off record as well, is that even some of the podcasts, we can send you the full file and you can use it because I think a lot of people's out there. We've gotten contacted by Xero, the accounting software, Xero and QuickBooks. Not sure if you're familiar with it, to
Yeah.
actually sponsor us an event that we're thinking of doing, and even had discussions about sponsoring our podcast. But I think if you can give them value, I think they're more than willing to do so. But yeah, I think definitely you've got so much wisdom to share. Honestly, I can be on this call for another how many hours if I'm honest with you. Um, I think, can I ask a question actually? One thing you said
Mhm.
that you were supposed to be your old business for 3 months, but after 3 weeks you left. Was there like a tossing of power? Was there an incident that occurred that they said, you know what, nothing happened?
No, no, nothing happened. There was just nothing left for us to do. We, uh, we worked with the new CEO on a list of things that they wanted us to take care of and accomplish. And the list was just not that long. And uh, I feel like I worked maybe a total of 20 hours over 3 weeks. And there was a call on my birthday. I remember it was my birthday because it was um, it was positioned as just some call with no purpose, but I was invited, so I decided to log on. And they had switched us from using Zoom. We used Zoom, we used Google Docs, we used Slack, and when I logged onto this call, it was Microsoft Teams. And it was the weirdest thing. I don't think I'd ever used Microsoft Teams. And it looked like the deck of the Starship Enterprise. And there were all of my employees sitting in these, and all of their heads were kind of misshapen because it's just, I think it's terrible, that tool. Sorry, y'all. But I was just like, what am I looking at? Like, I couldn't even recognize some of the people because their heads were like stretched or not appearing properly. And it was a birthday call for me, it turned out, and also a goodbye call. So that's when I realized, like, oh, I guess we're done. And the experience of seeing that poor excuse for technology when you're used to using Zoom, and also they were switching from Slack to Facebook for Business, which I didn't even know still existed as a product. At that moment, I think that's when I kind of started getting over it. I was like, what, this is terrible. Like, I don't want to work with a tool like this. I'm glad I'm leaving. Sorry, Microsoft. They probably improved it in the last couple of years, but I just thought it was, you know, and it's funny because the company had praised our culture. They said your culture is amazing. And a lot of the reason our culture was amazing is because we were we were always kind of a remote team. Even though we had an office, there was a lot of remote work going on. I was remote. And so we used best in class tools. We used Slack. So when during the pandemic, someone would say, hey, post a picture of your Christmas tree. And so everybody would post a picture of their Christmas tree or, whatever they celebrated. Right. And so it was a way of using technology to build culture and enable people to get to know each other, even though we were remote for the pandemic. And so what does the buyer do? They praise our culture, but then they proceed to just rip away all the tools that made our
Yeah.
culture work. Gusto was another tool that I love. And Gusto generated monthly employee surveys, just, like 2 questions, not lengthy surveys, but every month it surveyed on a different thing. And so you could keep your finger on the pulse of what was going on and how your employees were feeling. They took that away. So there were things that I thought, okay, well, it's good I'm leaving, because I am very stubborn about things like that and have high standards for how digital tools should work, since I've operated this company as a digital first company from the beginning, since my partner was on the other side of the country and I had a team in India. It had to be that way.
Yeah. What was your head count before you left?
We had 28 full-time employees, and then we had a full-time dedicated team of 25 in India that was through a vendor that we had worked with for 14 years. So that vendor, we were their first customer, and now they're a huge company. And when after we sold the company to Euromoney, I understand that they actually bought out that team from the vendor. So now those people,
Oh,
all
wow.
those people in
Yeah.
India who worked for us, they are part of Boardroom Insiders, which is, I think, a nice thing, because that's all
Fantastic.
they worked on all those years.
That's amazing. And I'm going to ask you a final question, just for you to give advice to any aspiring business owner, lessons learned for the next up and coming entrepreneur. But before I do so, any discrimination, sexism you experienced along the way, raising funds, bootstrapping, working with a PE firm, that you felt a level of discrimination?
Do you have another 2 hours?
Okay, don't worry about it.
It's all in my book. There's some quite amazing stories in my book, from the time I was an intern at a PR agency all the way through, to my sale. There was a very contentious call on during closing week, where my partner and I thought we were closing. Our banker thought we were closing, and the buyer said, "Oh no, we're going to close maybe in a couple days." And my banker actually used a lot of profanity on the call, and he wasn't even on video. He's like driving in his car. All you could see was this phone going like this, and he was yelling and he was swearing. And then someone asked me what I thought. They asked me and Lee, my partner, what I thought. Lee stayed quiet. And I'm a snarky person. I really am. In my personal life, I try to keep that out of business, but I made a kind of a snarky comment. They were more upset about my comment than the banker who said, "We've been sitting around with our thumbs up our asses since December." He said that, and they were more upset about what I said. And I guess you could argue that they were more upset about what I said because I'm the actual CEO, and he's the banker. He doesn't work for the company, but I had to apologize, and then I had to set up a special meeting with their CEO to make sure that, we're still aligned, as they put it. And, I had to do the big mea culpa thing. And I thought, why didn't Robert have to apologize? Like what he said was worse than what I said. So, people don't like to accept a tone from women. And that was probably the biggest thing I ran into at my own company, is my occasional tone or comments I would make that I thought were completely justified and benign if somebody else had said it. But, that kind of thing is common everywhere. But then there was out and out sexual harassment in other jobs. I mean, and the book details, some of my early jobs were working with women, very strong women. And so in a lot of places I worked, I didn't have that problem, which was great.
Yeah.
But a lot of the places I worked where men were in charge, from, my waitressing jobs to a PR agency I worked in, to the worst job I ever had, which has a whole chapter. There was just ridiculous incidents of sexual harassment. And I learned to deal with them with humor and with really putting people in their place. The older and the more confident I got, I had no problem just saying, go fuck yourself. Like literally, I would say that to them and, get out of my office. I was having none of it, but I was working with a lot of women who were a lot younger than me. And in one place I worked, the worst job I ever had, the women got together and sued the company and they won. And these were women in their early 20s. And from what I had since left the company by then, but I did get contacted by their attorney who said, did you ever see anything strange? And I told him everything I knew. And he probably called his client and said, are you out of your mind? You need to pay these women now. And from what I understand, they all walked away with enough for down payments for condos. So good for them because it was a ridiculous environment to work in.
Fantastic. And final question, just advice for up and coming entrepreneurs, whether it's resilient, because honestly, in your story, there's a lot of resilience. There's a lot of testing the market first. Sometimes what a lot of entrepreneurs do, they try to look for the perfect moment. But you said that you don't even have an issue going out, testing the market to get customer feedback. I remember one of the things that you said that really resonated with me was almost like a product market fit, where you were speaking about your partner who was helping to sell, and he said that nothing is selling. And then until when you made those changes, right, then things began to sell. So from your experiences, honestly, me personally, I think I've collected at least 20 to 30 different things that I've taken from your story. But my question to you is, what are the top 3 lessons you can share with the next up and coming Sharon Gillenwater?
There are so many, but if I had to narrow it down to 3, I mean, product market fit is absolutely essential. You don't have anything without that. So you have to find that. And for me, the best way to do it was actually working in the field, right? So if you're not working in the field, I think you have to put extra attention to that. I think the second one would be, don't go for perfection in anything you're doing because you're not going to find it. Just start. My first product was not impressive. It was hideous and clunky, and it didn't have enough content, right? But I did it anyway. And I, had to do a lot of kind of custom consulting and projects, kind of move my customers along that trajectory to using a self-service product. So, things are never going to be perfect. Just start building. And I think a third one that I didn't do, which I think if I had it to do over again, I would definitely do, and is easier to do now than it was back in 2006, is find a cohort. Find a cohort of people who are doing what you're doing, because it's so helpful to have their encouragement, their input, their subject matter expertise that you may not have, their referrals. When you have a startup and it's growing, you need everything. You need an accountant, you need a lawyer, you need a developer, you need salespeople. And it's very helpful to have a network of other people who you trust and respect, who can help. You can help each other along the way. And it helps your emotional state too, because it can be very lonely. You can doubt yourself a lot. You can sit there and say, oh, no, this is never going to work. And it's important that you get a more objective point of view from others who are in it at the same time. And I didn't do that. My partner filled in, though. He had a great network of entrepreneurs. I didn't. I live in San Francisco. most of my female friends, they're not entrepreneurs. They're working in healthcare, or they're working in law, or nonprofits, or they're not working at all. So I didn't have a cohort at all. And my network was my customers, which was important at the time. But I did a talk recently, and one of the things I put in there was like, build a network of people who are headed or are already where you want to go. Where I wanted to go was to be an exited entrepreneur. So I should have been networking with exited entrepreneurs, particularly women, through that whole journey. And I didn't do that. And now that I've exited and they've come out of the woodwork and found me, it's amazing. I mean, I have this huge network of women doing amazing things, men too, but women tend to flock to me because of my story. And it's enriched my life like you wouldn't believe. I mean, like, these are my people. I mean, I have my friends and stuff, but I am into this stuff. I am very interested in entrepreneurship and technology and what people are doing. And so that's why I can sit here and have a 2-hour conversation about it, because I could talk about it for 12 hours, right? And so not only have I developed this amazing network of entrepreneurs, but I have a inner circle of women who I've never met in person, who I text with all the time about, referrals, referring each other different places, about wins that they've had because they're still in the building stage. They haven't done what I've done yet. Celebrating their wins, talking about the election, referring each other to new people that we've met because we think that they can help each other. And that would have been amazing to have while I was actually building the company. And it can make a difference between being able to keep going or giving up, because you need something other than your own internal voice, which can often turn negative when things are tough, to encourage you and also help you by referring you to something or somebody who's going to help you.
Honestly, I've been so humbled by this podcast. It was interesting to let you know, this is the longest podcast we've ever done. And honestly, I feel we can go on for another 2 hours, but let me respect your time.
You're not the first to say that. You're not the first where that's happened. And in fact, I really love doing these in-person events with entrepreneurs. And I did 4 in the UK. I did 1 at Brown University on the way home in November. And somebody asked me, well, how were the events? And I said, well, they were all very different. They were different formats. Some I was on a panel. 2, I was interviewed by someone who had read my book. But in every single event I've done, not just in the UK, but anywhere else, the one constant is people will not leave, and we all get kicked out of the venue because the venue is closed. And so, like, I did one in Montreal, and they were flicking the lights on and off for 10 minutes to get people to leave, and people wouldn't leave. And I couldn't leave because I had a line of people who wanted to ask questions. And they literally, they're almost pushing us out at every single event we've done. And to me, that's successful, because to me, that says people, my motto is always leave them wanting more, not less.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
People wanted more. And it wasn't just about talking to me. It was about talking to each other. And that's what I'm talking about with build this cohort, build a network. They were, you're in the room and you hear this person ask a question of me, and it's the same question that you have, and it's the same challenge you have. So the first thing you're going to do is run over to that person and introduce yourself and say, oh, I've been struggling with that too. How much better is that than just wearing a name tag and saying, hi, I'm so-and-so, what do you do? Like, that's a terrible networking experience. Everybody hates it. But having a rich discussion with me and then connecting with other people, and that could be a game-changing connection happening in the room that has nothing to do with me, really. that's why they have to kick everybody out. And that's why the lights are going off and on. And so I want to do more of that. And I want someone to pay me to do it. So if,
I don't think you have an
if
issue
I
with it.
get if I get to the end of 2025 and I'm doing that, I would be absolutely thrilled.
I don't think you're going to have an issue doing it with it. And we're certainly going to play our part by posting this in places at the same time. Sharon Gillenwater, I just want to appreciate you. Thank you once more for your time. And for our audience as well, we just want to appreciate you, and we hope we'll see you next week as well. Please like and subscribe our page and our channel. All of Sharon's details, right, will be in the description below. Details towards her book. Please ensure that you get that book. In fact, it was the basis of which I reached out to her. I read the book and I said, I have to reach out to this lady. So please access that book and look out for her. Look out for her. She's passionate about this. She's passionate about advising those that are coming up behind her or haven't done what they're doing. They're still in the building process. Please, please, please reach out to her. She has been an absolute blessing. And once more, just want to thank you again for your time, Sharon, for being part of this podcast.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. See you soon.